Amin. You guys got the last word? Amin. You know that word. Ayub is Job in Arabic. Well, I love the book of Job. I have until what time? 12. Until 12. Okay, well, we got plenty of time. Okay, good. Well, we got plenty of time then, and maybe even some time for Q&A at the end, okay? I think the book of Job is one of the most misunderstood books in the Christian church. Whenever I teach on Job in the seminary in Spain, I've got a lot of young, eager students who are preparing to be pastors from charismatic or Baptist churches, brethren. I mean, it's a mix of different students from different backgrounds, and they'll say, well, the book of Job is about God's sovereignty. And I'd say, okay, show me in the book of Job where we find the word sovereignty. It is not in the book of Job. So saying the book of Job is about God's sovereignty, the thing is, nobody at all ever in the book of Job doubts God's sovereignty. It's kind of like saying, well, the Bible is about proving that God exists. You don't ever find any concern in the Bible about proving that God exists. The question is, who is God? How do we live with God? What does God expect from us? How can we worship God? Sometimes there are doubts. Where are you? Have you abandoned us, God? Like, there are these questions, but no one is ever like, well, we're not really sure if there exists God. So in the same way, nobody in the book of Job ever doubts that God is sovereign, meaning that he gets to do whatever he wants. So I'm going to be referring to a couple of parts of Job. If anyone wants to stop and look up the passage, let me know. But I know that you've already studied the entire book except for the last chapter. So I'm going to be referring to a lot of these. But if you want to slow down and read the text, that's fine with me. I'm happy to do that. So what is the setting? Well, first of all, the setting of Job is the Bronze period. So this is the same time as the patriarchs. Very interesting that Job is not a Hebrew and not an Israelite. Why would that be important? So I'm going to ask questions. This is what I do in the seminary too. Why is it important that Job is not an Israelite?
Answer, please.
Yeah. There are no wrong answers or anything. No one's getting graded. So why would that be important? Well, the answer. Do you have an idea?
Looking for our little Jamie Brock. She knows all this stuff.
Oh. So probably because the story is intentionally supposed to be for a universal audience. This is a story that is not just, oh, this is a story about Esther, who's a kind of national Jewish hero, or this is a story about, the monarchy of Israel or then Judah. This is a story that is really supposed to connect with people beyond the boundaries of Israel. So that's important. And we have a lot of cultural characteristics from the Bronze Age. For example, who is the priest of the family? It is the patriarch. In the same way that Abraham was the priest for his family, Job is the priest for his family. He's the one who offers sacrifices. And this is fascinating. We have the oldest title of God in the poetry part, right? There's two parts. We have this narrative section at the beginning. Then we have this series of letters going back and forth that are poems. I don't know if anyone does that anymore today. Do you ever sit down and write a poem to a friend, trying to convince him that he's probably a sinner, he just forgot something, or I don't know why we call these guys friends. They're not really friends, but anyway, they didn't have the Hebrew word frenemy. I think that's why we call them friends. And then you have that section at the end, the kind of postscript, which is chapter 42, which is also a narrative. But what is the name of God that we find in the correspondence when they're writing back and forth? It's the oldest name of God that we have in the Bible. It's not Yahweh. No, Yahweh, that's the name that we have in the narrative sections, which we'll talk about. It's usually translated the Almighty. It is El Shaddai. El Shaddai. That's the name that Job and his companions commonly use when they're talking about God. And that is a really old name. It is such an old name that we're not sure what exactly it means or where it comes from. There are words like this in the human language. For example, the word magic. It's an old Indo-European name. Where does it come from? We don't know. Apparently, this is the kind of thing it's like as old as humanity. We cannot trace it back to like Latin and then trace it back. We can't do that. There's some words like this. And El Shaddai is one of those words. We normally translate it the Almighty. But I think the runner-up for that translation, I think this is probably a little bit better translation, is God of the mountains, right? God of the mountains. From where will my help come? I lift my eyes to the hills. Where does Moses meet God? On the mountain. And this is not just an Israelite thing. Here in the Americas, I mean, not so much in North America, but like in Mexico and South America, when the people wanted to make an abode for their God, they would either build it on top of a mountain or they would build a mountain. That's what the pyramids are. That's what ziggurats are. That is when people said, well, we know that you meet the gods on top of a mountain. So if we don't have a mountain, we're going to build a mountain of our own. So this idea of like meeting God in the mountain, that's very important. And it comes up a lot in different parts of scripture. So El Shaddai. And again, El Shaddai, this is not like Yahweh, which is clearly the name of the God of Israel, right? It is a name that all the pagan people around Israel would also have known. El Shaddai is the strong God, the God who is in charge of the mountains, and who, if you want to meet him, you would have to go up to the top of a mountain. So this is kind of, we're trying to imagine what it would have been like for people to think about and to hear and to talk about stuff like this, like Job and his companions. So they're using this really, really old title from the Bronze Age. And Job, of course, is the priest for his family. The narrative introduction is quite interesting, right? We have God in his heavenly court. This is a theme that we find throughout all of the Hebrew Bible, or what we call the Old Testament. Throughout the entire Hebrew Bible, God is almost never alone, right? God has a whole court around him, in the same way as you would not think of like going to Spain and just seeing the King of Spain. His name is Philip VI. You would not see King Philip just kind of hanging out at the Pizza Hut, or they don't have Pizza Hut, Domino's Pizza, alone. What would you think of when you have the king? His court, right? And like, who would be some of the people in his court?
Ministers of defense, communications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd have those guys. You probably have the muscle, right? The bodyguards. You might have people visiting from other places, ambassadors. So this is exactly how the Hebrews, the Israelites, are thinking, and later the Jews. We don't use the word Jewish until we have the exile. The word Jew does not exist. You have people from the tribe of Judah, but the actual word Jewish is from the exile onwards. So if I use Israelite in Hebrew, it's because it's such an old story. So this is how they would be thinking, right? And who do we have at the beginning? And we see this in Isaiah 6, by the way, right? Isaiah 6, when the prophet Isaiah is called to be a prophet, who are there in the holy temple of God, like his kind of advisors? And he asks them a question. He says, who shall we send? Who is there in the temple in Isaiah 6? Martha.
Here am I, send me.
Yeah, so Isaiah's there, and he has the seraphim, right? And we also know of other members of the court. There are seraphim, there are cherubim, there are angels and archangels. We find a list of them later on in, I think it's Ephesians, powers, principalities, and thrones. And again, for the Israelites, for the Hebrews, these were all the different kinds of entities and things that existed in the divine court. And in Job, what happens at the beginning of the story? Who comes to the court? Well, we'll get to Satan, the sons of God, right? The sons of God come to the court. Again, this idea of the sons of God, this is a really, really old idea. Where else do we find the sons of God in the Old Testament?
The daughters of men, and that really weird.
Yeah, that little section at the beginning of Genesis 6, which is where the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and then they had children with them. And then what happens? Apparently, this is a big problem, because after that, we get the flood. So this is kind of like, okay, that's just like the straw that breaks the camel's back. I can't let this go on anymore. So that we have the sons of God in that curious little section of Genesis 6. And then we have them right here. We also have a psalm, a very old psalm that Jesus references during Holy Week. I have said that you are gods, right? That's the idea of like kind of deputized deity. We won't go into that psalm, but so the point is we have this idea throughout the Old Testament. It's not one of the main ideas, but the sons of God, they are there. They are part of the divine court, along with all these other creatures, with the seraphim, the cherubim, the angels, the archangels. Okay. And we find a curious character. Now, in your Bible, he might be called Satan with a capital S. In the Hebrew, there is no character in the Old Testament whose name is Satan. Okay. Satan is actually, in Hebrew, it's a title. Now, on to the New Testament, yes, we have the devil, Satan. Fine. But in the Old Testament, we don't have anyone named Satan. So what does the title Satan mean? The word Satan, the Hebrew word Hashatan, appears 5 times only in the entire Old Testament. 1 time in Numbers, we have it in Job, and 1 time in Zechariah. Okay, so what does it mean? Anyone have any ideas? What does Hashatan mean? The Satan? Not really, not the evil one. He makes problems. He does things that we would think are evil, but it's not the evil one. Like the adversary, right? So in Numbers, you have the angel who appears in front of the donkey, Balaam's donkey, this very interesting exotic story, where Balaam, who is from Syria, apparently has the ability to curse in the name of God. How does someone all the way from Syria who's not an Israelite have the ability to curse in the name of God? The story doesn't tell us, but it's very clear that God is at work far beyond the borders of Israel. We see that also in Job. Here is Job, way back in the patriarchal period, doesn't know anything about Abraham or Canaan or Palestine, but he's worshiping the true God. So the Bible is quite clear that God has all sorts of projects going on outside of just the promised land and the chosen people. And so Balaam is an example of that. So Balaam is on his donkey, and then the donkey stops because what? Because there is an angel there. There is an adversary there who is blocking the donkey. That word is Hasatan. Okay, so that angel is not bad, right? So that guy is there and he's blocking the donkey, and it uses the Hebrew word. The adversary, or in this case, one who is impeding your path, one who is blocking you, one who is making your plan cease. Okay. Now in Zechariah, that's a much later text. And in Zechariah, this is close to the closing of the Old Testament period. Then you do have the Satan, the adversary, who is doing something similar to in Job. So in Job, who is this figure, the Satan? He's kind of like the prosecutor, like he has a job, and his job is to go out there and find people who are maybe not doing what they're supposed to be doing and prosecute them. So it's not the kind of person you want to be in touch with. You don't want to hear from this person. You would be happy never to have the prosecutor of the city or the county ever talk to you. But on the other hand, they have their role and they do what they're supposed to do. So the Satan, the prosecutor in the book of Job, at least just in terms of the book of Job, is not necessarily evil. He is doing his job. And that's why, did you notice that God is not surprised when he shows up? He's not like, what are you doing here? Like, get out of here. He's doing his job. What have you been doing? And what's his answer? What's the answer of the prosecutor when God says, what have you been up to?
Roaming around.
Yeah, roaming around. And God doesn't say, well, that's a bad thing to do. It's kind of his job, right? So he's been roaming around, and then you have this beautiful and fantastic and amazing conversation, right? And God is proud of Job, right? And God boasts about Job. Job is so good. And then what does the prosecutor say? It's easy to be good when you're giving him everything that he wants. So in Christianity and in Judaism as well, we talk about the problem of evil. Okay, the problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? It's a problem. It's all over the Bible, and we encounter it in our lives all the time, right? Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, in Job, at the beginning of Job, we find the problem of good, right? Do people do what is good only because they get a reward? And that's basically what the Satan is suggesting. He's saying he's only doing good. He's only a righteous man because you give him everything he wants. Okay. And then the Satan gets permission to take stuff away from Job, right? And then Job's response is what? What's Job's response after like all of his stuff, burns down and the raiders come in, the Chaldeans, and yeah, and he said, I came into the world naked. I will go from this world naked. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And it says, and he didn't sin against God. Okay. So here's Job. He's going, and we learned something important here, by the way. And this is something that we can apply to our own lives. It's one of the main theological lessons that Job is trying to teach us, that the book is trying to teach us. We don't know the whole story, right? When we're reading Job, we know all about the divine court and the sons of God and the Satan coming in and the conversation between God and the prosecutor who's searching around for someone to prosecute. We know all that stuff, but Job doesn't know any of this. So this is one of the things that we need to take into account. When bad things happen to us or to the people around us, it doesn't mean that they're not that bad. It doesn't mean that they're not that serious. The book of Job never says that. But there are things that are going on that we do not know about. We do not have access to what is going on in that divine court. The divine court is there. We don't necessarily know what's going on in that divine court, though. So that's one thing with Job. And then the Satan goes back to God and says, what? And well, he's still boasting. He's like, look, he's still good. And then the Satan says, yeah, I haven't touched his body. And God says, okay, you can take away his health and his well-being, his physical well-being. And then that happens. And then my students always think this is funny. The one thing that the Satan never takes from Job is his wife, right? I'm not going to develop that theologically, but what is the advice that his wife gives Job? Yeah, exactly. Hey, throw in the towel, buddy. This is over. The show's over. It was a good run. Call it quits. It's interesting. The Hebrew doesn't say curse God and die. What does the actual Hebrew say? Because the Hebrew scribes, maybe they were superstitious, I don't know, but they just could not bring themselves to actually write the physical words curse God and die. So what does it say? That if you read the actual Hebrew, bless God and die. But what does it mean? Well, it means curse God and die. Everyone knew that, but just the scribes couldn't bring themselves to actually write down these words, curse God and die. Well, it tells us something about their culture, doesn't it? In the same way that they would not say Yahweh. We don't mind saying Yahweh. Of course, we say it with respect. But what do Jews say today? Like devout Jews, they will never say the word Yahweh. They will say Hashem. Yeah, well, we saw this in Nazareth. In Nazareth, Muslims will say Alhamdulillah, means praise be to God. Something good happened. Praise be to God. Christians will say Nashkur Allah. We thank God, or thanks be to God, or thank God. Something good happened. Thanks be to God. But a devout Jew will not say either praise be to God or thanks be to God. They will say Baruch Ha-Shem. Baruch is blessed. This is Baruch. This is also the name of Jeremiah's secretary, by the way. Baruch Ha-Shem. Blessed be the name. Because they're going to use the name, right? They don't want to say the actual name itself because it's so holy. In classical Judaism, there's only one man, one day a year in one place that can actually utter the name of God. Who is that? And when is that? I don't even know why I make notes. It is the high priest going into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Is the only time that Orthodox devout Jews in the first century, in the time of Jesus, would actually say the name of God. And this continues today with religious Jews. And sometimes you'll even see Jews will like G-D, just not even wanting to write down the whole name. I don't want to go on a rabbit trail. This is where we get the word Jehovah, by the way, because Yahweh, Y-H-W-H, this is God's name, but the Jewish scribes would put in the nouns, like the diacritical marks, for Adonai. Adonai means master. It's not necessarily a religious title. and you could say this is the master of the house or the master of the business or whatever. That's the word Adon or Adonai. Adonai, my master. So when they would see the word Yahweh, they would not pronounce it, but they would see the nouns and they would say Adonai, A-O-W. Now, we didn't know this for a while, so we just thought it was one word, and it spells the word Yahovah, Jehovah. But the actual name Jehovah is nowhere in the actual Bible. The name Yahweh is in there, and Adonai is in there. Anyway, that's a freebie. Let's go back to Job. So, well, come do 3 whole semesters of Old Testament, 4 whole semesters of Old Testament with me. Yeah, no, seriously. Any of y'all come to Madrid, hang out with us. We'd love to see anyone there. So, and then we find something curious. Job does not follow the advice of his wife, and it says something similar. What does it say about Job at the end of that chapter? And he did not sin against God with his lips. How is that different? And in all of these things, he did not sin against God. But the second time, once his health is taken away, he did not sin against God with his lips. What's the difference? Yeah. So I mean, he's gonna get there later on, but he did not curse God, and he was nice to his wife. Yeah. But it leaves kind of open a kind of a question mark, like, well, did he sin against God or sin in some other way? He didn't sin by what he said with his lips, but it's a question mark. See, the text doesn't actually tell us exactly what happens, but it kind of leaves us with the, well, did he sin in some other way? So then let's continue on. Then we have the fascinating, really what is the literary core of the book of Job, which are all these letters that are in the form of poems going back and forth. And we find a couple of things. First of all, that the book of Job, this is more of a pastoral note. It's about observing suffering. Observing suffering. Now, it's one thing to suffer when you suffer in your own life, but it can also be a very difficult and harrowing experience to observe suffering. And really, the book of Job is a long observation of observing suffering. In this case, the suffering of Job. And his companions are doing that too. They don't do a very good job at it, though. One of the things that I learned when I was doing my training for ordination, I was doing some chaplaincy work at Children's Hospital downtown, Santa Rosa, or Christus, that one. And oftentimes people are suffering, and the best thing you can do is what? Listen. Be there, present with them. I mean, maybe read a verse or two from the Bible, maybe pray with them if they want that, but really it is just the presence, just being with them. And that is something that Job's friends do not do. They do not do this well. We also find in the book of Job, let me ask you this. What do you think is the main error of Job's friends? Like, what are they doing? You have studied actually all their letters. What are they trying to do? Why are they writing these letters? Every time we do something, it's usually because we're trying to reach a goal. What are Job's friends trying to do in writing all these letters to him?
They help him back on track, and I think he does enough soul searching, he'll figure out where he went wrong, and
That's right.
back on it.
Yeah, and it's kind of subtle, right? And you kind of have to read between the lines sometimes in these letters. But sometimes they're like, well, you sinned. You didn't sin with your body. Maybe you just sinned with your eyes. Maybe you looked at the servant girl with lust, and that's why God took away all the good stuff. Or maybe you were proud, and it's just in your heart, and you didn't even realize it, but you were proud. That's why God is punishing you. So they have these strategies, right? But the key error, and this is where you get kind of the two of the main ideas in the Old Covenant, are law and wisdom. Okay, and here's like the heart of the theology of Job. The key error that the friends of Job make is that they think that the law of retribution is the essence of the cosmos. I'll say that again. They think that the law of retribution is the essence, like the backbone of of the cosmos, the universe, the created order. And we find proverbs like this in the book of Proverbs, right? And we'll find things like, well, if you're honest and you do a good job, God will bless you. And if you lie and you're deceitful, then it'll go bad for you. And are those things generally true in life? Yeah, they're not always true. Yeah, it can be good advice, but it's not always true. And so this is an error that the friends of Job that they're making. They think that wisdom is like law, like Torah, and it's not. Wisdom, the wisdom literature, whether it's Proverbs or then as it develops more Ecclesiastes and Job, it is trying to give us advice. Now, is there any time that you can get advice and say, you know, normally that would be good advice, but I think in my case, I need to do something different? Sure, right? Advice is advice. It is not law. And the friends of Job have taken wisdom from Proverbs. If you do what is good, God will bless you. It'll go well for you. If you do what is bad, things are not going to turn out for you. And then it's advice. It's a good guideline for life by and large, but it is not law. It is not this law of retribution. It is not always the case. And Job's friends think that it is. It is their key error. And in making this judgment about wisdom incorrectly, they are fundamentally misunderstanding who God is and why God does what he does. And you see this in the later books like Job and Ecclesiastes. They're much more sanguine about this. Like Ecclesiastes will say, I saw a man who worked hard and accumulated all this wealth. And what for? Do you guys know that? Most people don't know Ecclesiastes very well because it has so many lessons that make us really uncomfortable. But then he died and he left it to his son who was a fool and he spent the whole thing. What's the point of all this? This is my paraphrase of Ecclesiastes. And we've probably all actually seen that happen in real life, you know? And like, well, what was the point of that? Why did that guy spend all of those years working so hard to, you know, for whatever, make money, build up a business, and then the next generation was not responsible and that happened? And that's why he says vanity of vanities. Everything's vain, you know, this is how things are. Or he says, yeah, I saw the oppressed and they cried out for justice, but there was no one there to help them. This is also Ecclesiastes. We've all seen this in the world. I mean, Martha, especially in Africa. I mean, so many examples of that, right? The oppressed, we want justice, but there was no one there to help them. That's Ecclesiastes. So Ecclesiastes and Job they're having a conversation with the other books of wisdom, in this case Proverbs, which is the oldest one of the books of wisdom that we have. And they're having a conversation with Proverbs. And they're saying, you know, yeah, you know, we're not going to disagree with Proverbs, but we want to put some footnotes in there. You know, sometimes you can be good and just and things will not go well for you. Sometimes the just poor cry out for justice and there's no one there to help them. Sometimes. That doesn't mean that we leave God. It doesn't mean that we abandon God. It doesn't mean that we stop being righteous. No, doesn't mean any of those things, but that's the world. That's how the book of Habakkuk starts. I love the book of Habakkuk. Violence, right? Habakkuk is like an interview with God, the book of Habakkuk, right? And Habakkuk says, God, how long will you make me look on all this violence and corruption? And then God answers him, you know. So this is kind of the background of the conversation that's going on between Job and some other books that we have in the Bible. So we don't know the real story. We have in Job, then what happens when Job starts writing, or we have his first poem, I guess, in Job 4. He says, cursed be the day of my birth, right? So right now we have a problem, and we're going to find that Job, even though he's vindicated in the end, we're going to find that Job, he keeps deteriorating. We'll just say it like that. He keeps on having a harder and harder time accepting the unjust suffering that he's going through. And it is unjust suffering. It's not clear by the time you get to the end of Job what this whole thing accomplished, okay? And he says, cursed be the day of my birth. Right there, you kind of have a problem, right? What do we know about, what's the first blessing in the Bible? That's it, right? And it's for the animals, be fruitful and multiply. And then for the humans, be fruitful and multiply. That's like the first Great Commission. Be fruitful, multiply, spread throughout of the earth, subdue it, maybe not subdue it, but like govern it, take care of it for me. That's kind of, I think, the better way to translate that. So that's the first Great Commission in Genesis. And so right here, you got a problem because you have something that God says is good, fertility, birth, and then Job is already saying, cursed be the day of my birth. So already Job is starting to have some problematic statements. We're sympathetic, though. We can understand why he would say these things and think these things. And eventually he has a number of other complaints against God. What are Job's complaints against God? He's not showing up. And I think it's in chapter 19, if I'm not mistaken, where Job actually has this complaint. He's like, well, normally a leader or a ruler, like, I know where they are. I could go and present my case against them, but I don't know where God is. God doesn't have an address, and he's frustrated by this because he's sure that he's got justice on his side, right? And he just really believes, like, if I could only present my case to God, he would see that I'm right. This is how Job is thinking. I mean, this is not a caricature. So that's one of them. Where is God? He's not going to listen to my case. Now, does Job ever accuse God of being evil? There's a question. No, he never accuses God of being evil, but he accuses God of being absent. Yeah, absent, inaccessible, right? I'm crying out and no one hears me. And actually, one of Job's friends says that. He says, who among the saints, who among the holy ones, these are the sons of God, is going to listen to you? Yeah, there's a whole divine court. Are any of these sons of God going to help you out? And, the friend is implying, no one's going to help you out. And then, but Job accuses God of being amoral. Okay, so not immoral, but amoral. What does that mean, amoral? Yeah, that God doesn't care about right and wrong. This is kind of the vision of deism, which was popular a few hundred years ago, that God created the universe. He kind of got the whole thing running, and then he stepped back and said, okay, you figure out what you're going to do. I am not actively involved in the universe in terms of the execution and the carrying out of justice. So that's another accusation that Job makes, that he is amoral, he is inaccessible. Job curses creation, and in doing that it curses his birth, and in so doing curses God's creation, which goes against what we know, which is that God created and he saw that it was good. So these are some problematic elements. But what is the great vindicating quality of Job? Why does God show up in the end and say to his friends, you have spoken wrongly of my servant Job? What is the great thing that Job does in all of this? In spite of these are real problems in Job's heart. Job, he never what? He never gives up, and he never gives up being righteous. He remains righteous. He keeps on being a good person. That is the answer to the problem of good. What the Satan says at the beginning, well, if you take his stuff away, you're going to see he's not going to be this upright, pious, pure, righteous, kind, generous person anymore. He's going to go the way of sin. And Job never does that. Here's a question that I ask all my students. It's not an easy question. What is the central theological question of the Old Testament? The entire Old Testament. There's one burning question. Why the exile? Why does God permit the exile of Judah? Around the year 586, the Babylonians come in, and then there's a couple of waves. The temple is destroyed. The Ark of the Covenant, all due respect to Indiana Jones, is probably melted down, and the gold is put in the treasury of Babylon. And basically, the monarchy is also practically destroyed. Why the exile? Why did God permit the exile? And it's during this time that we probably have, the story of Job is really old, but it's probably during the exile that we have the whole framing with the narrative of Job as we have it today. So what would that have meant for the Jews in the exile? Many of them are thinking, we've been righteous, we've been good. Yeah, some of the Jews have not, but in the same way that Habakkuk says, well, okay, you're going to send the Chaldeans to destroy the Judeans, but the Chaldeans are even worse than the Judeans. How can you do that, God? That's Habakkuk's second question. Okay, and then God kind of answers it. So why the exile? Why does God allow for the exile to happen? Now, the classic answer that we get from Deuteronomy, Samuel, Kings is idolatry. That's the main reason. But there are other implications there. And the book of Job, when it was like during the exile and people are listening to the book of Job with all of its narrative framing and everything like that, they're thinking, ultimately we don't know. Ultimately, there are questions we cannot answer. In the same way, Job could never actually answer the question, why did God allow for me to go through all of this unmerited suffering? Job never actually has an answer. He never gets an answer. God never actually answers his question. In the same way, the people of Israel could have felt like Job. They probably would have felt like Job. But then what's the application? That doesn't mean that you stop obeying Torah. You have to keep on walking in the Mosaic law. Just because you don't understand why God has apparently abandoned you, we find this a lot in Isaiah. They say God has forgotten us. This is similar to Job's complaint. Where is God? God has forgotten us. God has abandoned us. Where, oh God, are you? Right? We find these concerns a lot in the prophets. And it's God's will that these sentiments be included in the Bible. It's not like God is worried about it. Let's say this to Muslims. God is not scared by our questions. He's not scared or worried about our doubts or our concerns as long as we address them to him. So this is really the heroic nature of Job, even though he has a number of significant problems and he's got some complaints against God that they never get answered, but Job just lets them go. Behold, I am vile, I am a worm, Job 40, verse 4. But he keeps on being righteous. He keeps on being a man of integrity in the midst of his suffering. In the same way that the remnant of Judah, the Jews, were called to continue being faithful to Torah, even in the land of exile. In the same way that we, even in the moment of our suffering, our poverty, our lack of health, that we are called to continue being faithful. We don't know the whole story. We don't know the whole story of what's going on behind the scenes up in the heavenly court. Now, let's look at a fantastic and amazing thing. I know my Redeemer lives. What is that about? My Redeemer. Who is Job's Redeemer? It's not God, because Job has all these complaints about God. Who is Job's Redeemer? It would need to be one of the representative among the sons of God, right? Job is hoping that there will be a Goel, a Redeemer, or probably a better translation is a rescuer. A rescuer, in the same way that there is the prosecutor who's going to come and say everything that's wrong. What do you need if someone's prosecuting you in court? You need a defense attorney. You need someone to rescue you, right? You need someone to argue your case, to establish your innocence. And what an amazing thing. I mean, it's so old. I mean, especially the verses, the poetry part of Job is really, really old stuff. But what an amazing thing, because among the sons of God, I mean, no Israelite would have thought of this. No one would have been able to foresee the incarnation of the second eternal person of the Trinity, the Son, in the person of Jesus Christ. But we know it. I mean, we can say, yes, that's right, Job. Even though you didn't know the full picture of the Holy Trinity, yeah, there is a Redeemer. For we have one advocate, right? We have one advocate, and that's a New Testament title. There is one mediator between God and man, Jesus Christ, the man. So all of that is the idea that we have an advocate, we have someone to argue our case. So Job, of course, is thinking one of the sons of God would take up this noble cause. That's something much more dramatic and much more powerful is going to eventually happen. But his Redeemer does live. A few final points. Ayub, the name is a play on words. What does Job mean? Do we know? Okay, well, it means something it's an Aramaic name, and it means one who repents. So like repenter, it's not a common word, but a repenter, one who repents. And that makes sense, right? Because at the end, when Job finally is confronted by the majesty of God, and God, I love this. What does God say to Job? What's the content of God's speech to Job? Does he say, well, let's have a philosophical conversation about the nature of justice? No. he asks him a whole bunch of questions about creation. Yeah, about creation, about nature. Okay. So there's repenter, but it's also a play on word, and the Hebrews love doing plays on words. A lot of plays on words in the Bible. We miss them because we don't read the Bible in Hebrew. But it also sounds similar to a Hebrew word, which is enemy, right? Do you remember that verse where Job again is complaining, and it says, "And God has made me his enemy." You know, what did I ever do to God that God would treat me like an enemy? This is one of his accusations. So it's a play on words. The name means one who repents, which he does at the end, but also you have this Hebrew word enemy. Why is God treating me like I am his enemy? So what do we finally learn at the end? And I'll wrap up with this because it's 11:51. What do we learn about wisdom? There's a beautiful poem in the middle, or maybe 2/3 way through the book of Job, and it's about wisdom. You guys, or you all studied that, right? It's just this ode to wisdom. Previously, people thought that was part of, scholars thought that was part of Job's letter, but current scholars think that no, that's just the narrator. We don't know who the narrator is, but there's a narrator, obviously, telling us this whole story. The narrator is kind of saying, let's just step back and have an interlude. We saw the first part of the opera, go to the bathroom, get a Coke, and just calm down for a minute, and then we'll continue. And that is what we think in terms of modern scholarship, contemporary scholarship. That's what's going on with that wisdom poem. It's kind of meant to say, hey, take a break from all this drama of Job going back and forth and getting ready to hear from God, and just consider what wisdom is. So wisdom is a member also of the divine court. What do we learn about wisdom in Proverbs? Wisdom is characterized as a woman. Good. And what are some of the jobs of wisdom in Proverbs? She's standing there. She's calling on young men to be wise, to be good, right? Don't go with the prostitutes, this sort of thing. We also know that wisdom is rare. We find this in Ecclesiastes. There's a fantastic verse that says, one thing I resolved, which was to be wise, but it was beyond me. So this idea that wisdom is like always an ongoing project, right? Like you always have to keep on searching after wisdom. And in the book of Job, the whole poem, or the ode to wisdom, it talks about mining. Mining today is a dangerous thing, but imagine how dangerous mining was back then, going deep into the ground, trying to find jewels and gold and silver and stuff like that. It's dangerous today. It was really dangerous back then. So that's telling us about wisdom. So the book of Job is telling us, first of all, there's a lot of stuff that we don't understand what's going on. Second of all, there is a Goel. What's the other main book in the Old Testament that has a Redeemer or a Goel in it? It's kind of like the main save the day part of the book. It's a lady, and she needs to have a Redeemer to produce a son for her deceased husband. Ruth. Yeah, Ruth. Boaz is her Redeemer. It's the same word. It's the same Hebrew word. And then finally, we learn that we don't have the ability to understand what God is doing, but God is not amoral. God may feel inaccessible sometimes, but he is paying attention. He is with us. And that sometime when we are confronted with the reality of suffering, whether observed suffering like Job or whether in our own lives, a good thing to do is to contemplate creation. And I'll end with this. This is the second time I say this. There are two creatures. There are two creatures in the book of Job they're called the beasts of chaos. They were present and well known in all the other ancient Semitic peoples. And one of them is feminine, one is masculine, one of them comes from the sea, one of them comes from the land. And if we read their description, people are always like, well, that's a hippopotamus or that's a whale. That's really not helpful to try to reduce these things to actual creatures that exist today. What are the two beasts of chaos that we find in Job? Behemoth and Leviathan, right? Leviathan is the female beast that comes from the sea. Behemoth is the masculine beast that comes from the land. Where are we going to meet these two beasts again? I saw one beast arising from the sea and another beast arising from the land. Revelation. Yeah. So these guys, they stick around, okay? Now, they're not part of God's court, by the way, of the divine court, but God still has mastery over them. That's how great El Shaddai is. That's how powerful he is, even these beasts of chaos. And read that. Read the description of Behemoth and Leviathan, and ask yourself, is God talking about these guys because he's saying, you know, Job, this is what it takes to get through the times of chaos and difficulty. Look at Behemoth. Look at Leviathan. Don't just think, wow, what a great creator God is. Yeah, by all means think that, but also think, I'm part of this creation. I can emulate them, maybe not in their physical force, but in their perseverance, in their steadiness. And at the end, we learn what? That at the heart of creation is not the law of retribution, but God's wisdom. God's wisdom. And if you read the intertestamental books, you'll find that this theme of wisdom, it continues to be developed by the people of Israel. And then finally, we get to the height of wisdom. What does Paul say about the wisdom of God? That Jesus Christ is for us the wisdom of God. And in some way, this principle of the divine wisdom becomes a person in Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, 11:57. How's that, Martha? Pretty good? Okay.
Didn't want you to stop. Oh my God.